Well, we are live. Welcome to everybody who is going to begin joining us online, and welcome everybody who's here to our weekly history, theology, and philosophy meetup. We do these pretty well every Tuesday night at 7:30 here at Toronto Centre Place. I'm the coordinator of the meetup. My name is John Hamer, and I also serve as pastor of the Community of Christ Toronto congregation whose facility this is. And my background is in history, but it's also through academic work, through publishing on the history of maps and things like this. And so in this particular case, we're going to be looking also all the way back at some history in terms of antiquity and also some textual criticism, and as we're trying to talk about the sort of not always fun topic of homosexuality in the Bible, which we picked this year because we picked this week anyway because we're entering LGBTQIA plus Pride here in Toronto. So we always begin. I didn't begin this time. I don't have my slides that have the intro on here, but we always begin by talking about our mission, and our mission is built into our wall, and it is invite everyone to community. We have little icons that represent things. Continually learn and grow. One of the ways that we believe in continually learning and growing is through, we're all past college age here. So many people, when they're out of college, unfortunately, like you cease to read books. The learning is already done, but we have a wonderful community that gathers here for continually learning and growing, to abolish poverty and needless suffering, to pursue peace and justice, and to live life meaningfully together. And I'm really excited on these themes this week that we have as guests visiting us from Kenya, Joseph and Jennifer Tugunda, is how it's supposed to say? I'm sorry, Joseph and Jennifer Tugunda, who are partners with the congregation. They are founders of a children's integrated center in Kenya, where they're doing just incredible work in terms of this mission of continually learning and growing, abolishing poverty and suffering, and living life meaningfully, and pursuing peace. And so, briefly, just so that we can talk about why we do those things, that we invited Joseph to just share briefly about what Tanya is and what it does, and how, for example, the congregation's little role that we had to help out with one of the programs. Can we get the microphone, Landro, for Joseph? Just speak into this.
Sorry, I'm like 5 seconds behind.
That's okay.
You're still talking to me.
Hello. My name is Joseph Kigunda, and I come all the way from Kenya, which is one of the countries of East Africa, to the equator. You are very far north. We are at the equator. My background is also education.
Could you speak closer to the microphone? Could you speak closer to the microphone?
So long as I don't swallow it.
Yeah, that's good.
That's better.
Yeah. Yeah, my name is Joseph Kigunda, and I come from Kenya. Kenya is one of the countries of East Africa. And today I'm privileged to stand in your ministry today and to proclaim that the Lord is our Savior and the Lord of my Savior. And that in our ministry also, I very humbly wish to recognize the presence of somebody who taught me in high school over a century ago. Charles Boyd was my teacher in Chuka High School many years ago in Meru. Yeah. And my background is education, so much of education of the deaf. I took the education of the deaf at the University of Rochester, upstate New York, and when I went back to Kenya, I was involved in the Ministry of Education, trying to give directions to the education of the deaf in the country, the job I did until I went on retirement. So when I went in retirement, together with my wife, Jennifer, we felt the Lord is calling upon us to think of the other children who nobody actually cares about. This is children with disabilities, the deaf, the mentally challenged, and also children who have been taken from the streets of Nairobi, and children from dysfunctional families. We felt the Lord is calling upon us to take care of this group of children. Normally, nobody takes care or thinks about them. Tanya Integrated Center was started in the year 2000 by me and Jennifer, whose also background is special education, and together we have worked together. During the time we have been in operation, we have seen the Lord availing to us children that normally you think you cannot do anything, but He shows you the way how to go about it. We have children who are mentally challenged. We have the category of the deaf. We have also children who are taken from the streets of Nairobi. We happen to be in the Maasai land. Maasai land is the area where people are stuck in their traditions. They didn't change during the colonial time when the British were and colonized Kenya. They remained very undermined. And even today, a few of them, they are very much held to their traditions. They subject young children to FGM. This is female genital mutilation, and they also give out young children, girls, as young as 10 years to be married by old men who probably have even other 3, 4, wives. The children go and grow in those homes. So we realize in Tanya, we need to give a warmth to this kind of children and retain them there and teach them and give them education. So Tanya, as a children's home as well as a center in education where we teach them. To date, we are having about 172 children, all from the primary school, others in high school. We have those in high schools, and also we have some in colleges. And together with that, we have very successful stories that we have seen over the years. We have those who have managed, despite their challenges, they have managed to be useful members of the society. We have girls who have managed to go through our system, and they are employed and they are working. And also, we have managed to get those who can't work because of their handicapping conditions, but we have given them trains. We emphasize on trains, skills and development. Among some of the cases that have been very unique is that we managed to get a child from the national park who had been adopted by monkeys. Looks strange, but it's a fact. She was gotten there by tourists when they went to visit Lake Nakuru National Park. And then this child was taken to a children's home in Nakuru. When that children's home was closed, her name was Charity, the name that was given for the manager who was running that center. She was Charity, and she came up with this name. She still have it. This girl, it was impossible to stay with other children. She stood alone. She was doing things alone. She behaved more or less like the monkey. But over the years now, we have been with her for about 4 years. She now has started giving a human face. At least it can hit from the plate. And before, she was throwing food on the floor and start picking it. And what we have not managed to get from Charity, we have not managed to toilet train her. So she's always on diapers. We have other children like Lucy. Lucy was actually gotten from the streets of Nairobi. She has the combination of mentally challenged and also deafness. And since the police could not understand this child, she found her way to Tanya. We have been able to actually rehabilitate this girl. She is very, very happy now, and she was drooping, now she doesn't, and she is able to observe table manners, and many, many, many other cases. With me, allow me to have my wife to just give you a brief, how are we got involved as a family.
I think, Joseph, what we'll do is that there'll be time afterwards for people who want to. We'll be able to continue the discussion, and also we have some wonderful brochures about Tanya and all the wonderful work that's being done.
Okay.
And so thank you so much for being here.
Okay.
And we're really excited about all of the work you're doing.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Pastor.
And there'll be time after. Let me give this to you, because it's next to my marker. And so there'll be time afterwards. I don't think there's enough. We can't just pass these all out. But if you're interested in finding out about the programs and all of the incredible things that are happening, obviously in Tanya, in terms of rescuing special needs girls and the other things that Joseph has already shared with, there'll be plenty more to talk about. It's a long-term partnership, as we've mentioned. Chuck, who is a longtime former pastor of the congregation here, has a 50-year relationship with going to Kenya. So on this. So, all right. Let's see if is this going? Yes. So the topic tonight. What does the Bible say about homosexuality? And I'll say that in the course of preparing this over the course of last week, I was not as happy to read the exact verses again, because I tend to not, let's say, dwell on the particular verses that get cherry-picked. But we'll go through some of them today, and we'll see with what we decide we're going to do with it. So in the first place, here with my little icons here, we've got a Bible, and we've got talking about, here the gay pride flag, the LGBT rainbow flag. So although people assume that the short answer of this question is simply the Bible says no, to this particular topic, I'm going to argue here actually that if we're going to have a short answer, the short answer would probably be rather nothing in particular. It's specifically, let's say, in terms of an actual focus on this particular topic, nothing of relevance anyway to us today. And so, of course, there are plenty of verses that have general relevance. And so, from Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself, I am the Lord. And from Galatians, quoting that, the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. So in other words, in general terms, these sorts of ideas are they're applicable throughout in different texts. But I think in order to actually talk about this question, we have to roll back a little bit and ask, what is the Bible? And we've done this more than once in these kind of lectures. Leandro, we're actually also running out of chairs.
Okay.
So I don't know if there are...
Don't worry.
Yeah, thank you. Although it's often, anyway, in English, read in a kind of an archaic English translation, and that allows people to kind of feel like the Bible is maybe speaking with a single voice, and it's certainly published all together as one text. And so I just have here all of these wonderful begets and other kinds of archaic language that we read out of the Bible, and we can definitely think of like Bible speak, thou and thee, and sort of kind of Shakespearean with an emphasis on begetting and stuff. In fact, of course, as we well know, that this is not a single text at all, but rather multiple texts and multiple voices that have been gathered together. These texts have been written by scores of different authors in different languages over the course of centuries, and that the different authors therefore necessarily have different worldviews, even because it's too long a time period, and also jumping through different languages from the earliest Hebrew to Aramaic to finally Greek in terms of the Christian Bible. As we've seen when we've done different histories of the Bible and the Christianity in previous lectures, we're all pretty aware that the canonization itself, the collection of which titles and which books are going to actually be published together in the Bible is essentially the last thing that happened. And so because that is happening centuries after any of the books, even the last of the books is being written, more or less certainly none of the earliest authors have any sense at all that their text is going to be somehow grouped together in this anthology that is going to be read together as a thing called the Bible. They are not speaking as if they understand that they are part of the Bible. They are writing their own text, and that text eventually gets all grouped together. But it's a very different perspective if you're thinking of that author's perspective. At a certain point, New Testament writers, for example, are quite aware of, let's say, the canon that becomes the Old Testament, because the New Testament writers who are writing in Greek, the Christian writers, when they think of Scripture, they're thinking of the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, the Greek translation. And so that has come together and has they have essentially a set of texts which is much larger than what's now considered the Jewish canon. So the Jewish canon doesn't include some of these texts, didn't end up making it into the Hebrew Bible of almost all rabbinic Judaism. And it also includes more books than Protestants have, since Protestants also share that same Old Testament perspective. It's the one that Catholics have, right? So Catholics' canon is based on that. So we call that extra books the Apocrypha. And we're actually having, so on July 17th, we're having a thing on the Apocrypha. So that's that extra set of books that are not in either the Hebrew or Protestant canon, but are in the Catholic and Orthodox canon. So anyway, these authors in all of these different texts don't have a sense that they are writing the Bible, at this thing that emerges much later. The biblical authors then, as a result, strongly can disagree with each other. They are writing their own text, and then someone else is writing their own text. They may well be aware of each other. They may well be writing an answer to the other author. Different biblical authors in the different traditions specifically are often quite at odds with each other. So the authors, for example, of the wisdom tradition books, for example, things like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and things like that, are often quite negative about the prophetic books and prophets and what prophets are saying. Prophetic people are likewise often decry the people who just think that they can get along with just wisdom, when in fact the revealed word is what's more important as far as the prophets are concerned. And so they actually condemn each other within the text of the Bible itself, or what now is the Bible, each in their own little book, what they were originally doing. So an example that I think is pretty powerful, if we go to Deuteronomy, one of the texts of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, they're often called the books of Moses. They're attributed to Moses, they're not written by Moses. There's a text in Deuteronomy called, where we read, "No half-breed may be admitted into the assembly of the Lord," or of Yahweh. "Not even his descendants to the 10th generation may be admitted into the assembly of Yahweh. No Ammonite or Moabite may be admitted to the assembly of Yahweh. Not even his descendants to the 10th generation may be admitted to the assembly of Yahweh. Never, as long as you live, must you seek their welfare or prosperity." So this is a kind of a harsh one, as a lot of among the different things that are in the law, let's say, in that part in the Deuteronomy, the second law. So Ezra, so the question is, who are the half-breeds? So in this case, so Moabites and Ammonites are the neighbors of the people of Israel. So the people of Israel, this is written in the first temple period, and so this is that period of time prior to the first destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC. So that period of time, there is Judah is a little hill kingdom in the Iron Age, and Judah's immediate neighbors are Moab and Edom and Ammon. And so if the person is from Ammon, which is essentially Jordan, or Moab, which is also over in Jordan today, if you then marry one of them and you have a kid, then that's a half-breed. And so the half-breeds are not allowed to be part of the assembly of Israel. They're not allowed to be part of Israel as far as this commandment is concerned. And, by the way, 10 generations later for Moabites, you're still not allowed in because that's anyway the commandment, right?
And even if you have a wife who's one of those, that comes from among the Ammonites or the Moabites,
That's right.
she is not a part of Yahweh's community.
That's right. So the Moabites aren't admitted, and and your descendants. They're not allowed to be considered to be part of Israel.
But the Israelites marry them?
You can marry them, but you're not supposed to.
But
So if you do, they and your children are going to be not considered part of Israel. Yeah. So because you're a half-breed then. And so this is essentially saying that taint, as far as this commandment is concerned, lasts 10 generations. So sins of the father or whatever are vested upon the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, 10 generations. And they're not admitted, according to the law anyway. So Ezra, who is one of the core leaders of the community after then, we mentioned this Deuteronomy is written shortly before, in the few generations before the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. Then the people are in exile, the leaders are in exile in Babylon. Then Babylon falls to Persia. The Persian Empire is this first great Middle Eastern world empire. The Persian Empire, the emperor allows the elite members of the Israelite community who are in Babylon to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple and create their own, essentially, Judean province of the Persian Empire under Persian rule. And so Ezra, who is a member of the Persian court, but who is Israelite by birth and practice, it goes back and is essentially one of the leaders who is allowed to be in charge of that little province then of the Persian Empire. So he helps rebuild the temple, and he also, by tradition, and probably scholars also think, he may well be one of the leaders who, or at least is in charge of supervising, if not himself, actually editing what becomes the Torah, what becomes the Pentateuch, those 5 books that are now attributed to Moses, but actually were originally made up of lots and lots of different sources that got put together in one collection. So maybe Ezra is the person who helped do that. So Ezra, when we read about Ezra is in some of the historical books called, in the Protestant version of this anyway, Nehemiah and Ezra, the books of Nehemiah and Ezra. It's one double book in the Jewish canon. We read in the book of Moses, which is to say that quote that we had from Deuteronomy. So in other words, Deuteronomy 23:2-4, it was found to be laid down that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. When the people, so they're reading that aloud, and when people heard that law, they separated off from Israel all those who were of mixed blood. So this is a law that at the time of Ezra, people hadn't been aware of. They now read it out loud as they're reading the law kind of for the first time, and anybody who is of mixed blood now gets separated out and they don't count anymore as part of Israel. And all those who had married foreign women, they dismissed them together with their children. So if you were already married to a Moabite, that's what you divorce them, and all your kids, you disown them all. And so that was essentially Ezra's response to this commandment, which he wanted to very zealously uphold, right? So as far as Ezra's rules were, there's Israelites, and there's everybody else, Moabites. There's a very strong boundary, and that boundary lasts forever, 10 generations. I mean, that's as far as anybody can imagine. My family's been in North America for 16 generations, and that takes you back to 1600s. So I mean, anyway, 10 generations, that's a long time. Okay, so however, at the very same time as Ezra, there was a prophet who, we don't know the name of this prophet, is anonymous, who is the author of a book called Ruth. And this author has a very, very different view of Israelite men marrying Moabite women. So if you are familiar with this, the book of Ruth, it's a very short book, but a very well-written and engaging book in the Bible, where essentially an Israelite woman named Naomi moves to Moab, with her sons and her husband. Her sons and husband all die. Meanwhile, her sons have married Moabite wives, and more or less now she's without a kin group. One of the daughters-in-law goes back to her own people, but Ruth is this incredible, devoted family member, daughter-in-law, who more or less says, I don't know if I have this quote. I didn't put it in, but anyway, I'll go where you go, your God will be my God. So she essentially is adopted into Israel and becomes a convert to the worship of Yahweh, to Judaism, First Temple Judaism, and is ultimately the most loyal potential member of the religion that you would have then, as sort of in this story. And what ends up happening as the story unfolds, or as it ends, is essentially so Naomi up there is the mother-in-law, married again to this the boy that has died. Ruth ultimately ends up finding a new husband in Bethlehem, or Hebron, either Bethlehem or Hebron, and where her mother-in-law is from, named Boaz, and he has a son named Obed, who has a son named Jesse, who has a son named David. And so just within then 3 generations, Ruth is the then great-great-great-grandmother, great-great is all, grandmother of David, who is essentially, the most important, king and the most important figure, other than Moses, let's say, in all of the Old Testament. And so essentially what the author here of Ruth is saying is that not only can Moabites enter the congregation of Israel, regardless of what it might say in Deuteronomy, but their children within not 10 generations, but just a few generations, not only can become a part of that, but can in fact be David himself, the king. So it's quite a competing perspective right at the same time. So as we saw here anyway, Ezra I kind of am more on the side of the author of Ruth than I am on Ezra's side. So if you can imagine, but anyway, that's my own partisan bias. But anyway, Ezra believes in exclusion, a very literal interpretation of law. He refuses to admit Moabites or children of mixed marriages, and destroys the family as men following Ezra renounce their wives and children, right? Author Ruth, by contrast, believes in inclusion, tells a story that illustrates the fact that the law had never been interpreted literally. Ruth the Moabite marries Boaz, an Israelite. Ruth follows Yahweh, is admitted to the assembly, and if the law were interpreted as Ezra wanted, King David would have to be excluded, right? So that's conflict, right? So just trying to illustrate here that there are competing voices that have different perspectives. They weren't originally in the Bible, but then when they both all got made into what we now think of as the Bible, that means that different competing voices are all within that same text. So the composite text is therefore self-contradictory, right? So both of these, the author of Ruth and also Ezra are in the text, as is the Deuteronomy text. The individual authors have often diametrically opposed views, and the result is just inherently self-contradictory. So what should also be clear to absolutely everybody, I think, is the authors are limited by human capacity and their own context. So every individual text is composed by a human author who is limited by his, and in some cases her, because there are female authors in the text too, their own capacity and context. So if they're all in the distant past, they didn't have any access to all kinds of knowledge and ideas that we take absolutely for granted. And so that could, as we've talked about in many other things, that includes everything from physics and cosmology to chemistry, genetics, and then also ideas like the modern post-Enlightenment idea of the self. And so these are ideas that we, for example, once we have those things, once we have our modern, let's say, idea of time that's based on the fact that we have clocks, and our idea of maps that is based on the fact that our phones tell us where we are at all times, all of these kind of ways that we think. I was just talking about how where we are right now, because we have computers, it's more or less impossible for us not to think of our own brains as computers with hardware and software. They obviously didn't have that metaphor for thinking about brains just 150 years ago. What they were then thinking when they would make an analogy of how they understood their brains, they would use mechanical instruments. They think of it all like a wind-up, like the Tin Man or something like that, because they had clocks and things like that. You take that back to 2,000 years, they don't have any kind of wind-up things. They're not thinking of their brains as little machines. They're thinking of their brains as animals that need to be under control. So it's the idea that you get the analogy that Aristotle and everybody has is that essentially that there's You have inside you the passions that are like the horses, and you have to be the charioteer, or your intellect has to be the charioteer that keeps that harnesses that, right? So essentially we have different paradigms that we can't actually hardly get out of. We have a sense, for example, that time is money, because everything for us is, on the one hand, we measure time so precisely and are thinking about time at all times, and then simultaneously every single thing that we do is monetized. Time is money would be absolutely meaningless to people 2,000 years ago. They don't have money in the same way that we do, or think of it in the same way, and they don't think of time in the same way that we do. Okay, so even within all of this one's context, humans err. So that's just nature of humanity. Nobody's perfect. So necessarily then, if we have a bunch of people that are limited and are making mistakes, when you bring that all together, this is going to make a composite text that has lots of errors in it when it's combined. This is also borne out through an unbelievably extensive academic study that the biblical texts have been subjected to over the course of the past several centuries. Essentially, the discipline of literary criticism itself, which is the Western academic discipline of reading the text and determining in terms of the textual criticism, what was the original language of the text? How can we reconstruct this text back to the earliest version of it, because it has gone through, for example, all of these different copies that the monks have been doing throughout all of history, and we have to get back to the original one. So that's lower criticism. And then higher criticism, which is who is the original author, who is the original audience, what does the text mean, and how would it have been understood by its original audience, so that kind of context. So that discipline itself was essentially created to study the Bible, because people were very interested in the Bible, have been very interested in the Bible. So that also now has shown a bunch of findings that are conclusive. So one of those findings is that some of the Bible's texts are pseudepigraphical, which is to mean they are not written by who they say are they're written by. So an example would be several of the wisdom books claim that, like Ecclesiastes, will claim that it's written by Solomon. It's written many hundreds of years after the time period when Solomon would have been alive, if Solomon is in fact a historical figure, which isn't clear. So we can't say that for sure, whether Solomon is a literary character or whether there's a historical Solomon. And so certainly, though, the book isn't written by him. Likewise, we know that for the book of Daniel, for example, which was written many hundreds of years after the events when Daniel would have been alive. And then once again, we can tell that because literary criticism has identified just numerous anachronisms that allow us to date the book very precisely to whatever it is around the year 137 BC, as opposed to when it needed to have been written, which would have been like the 560s BC. So some of the books are definitely not what they claim to be. So we know there are errors. Historians have likewise shown that many of the stories within the different texts of the Bible are not historical. And at a certain point, a lot of this can't be too surprising. I always mention we're aware that, for example, the Tower of Babel, this and many other stories like that, have all of the hallmarks of regular mythology, where you essentially are wondering, why do people all speak different languages? One of the ways that people tell those stories is that they create sacred story or myth in order to describe those things. As we now understand the history of the development of language, obviously there was not simply one language all at once and then suddenly everybody was speaking different languages, but rather languages have all been evolving, and linguistics can take us back very far as it reconstructs the language family trees, and we realize that Sanskrit is related to Latin, etc., and Arabic is related to Hebrew, but in other words, those families are different from each other, right? And although then many people uphold a faith claim that the Bible is inerrant, that's just a tradition. That isn't the Bible doesn't actually make that claim, or in the text of the Bible don't claim inerrancy for the Bible, and it also is demonstrably incorrect. So it isn't meant to be attacking anybody's faith or how their let's say, the way they interpret Christianity or Judaism, or their actual faith in Christianity and Judaism, but rather to help you to then maybe say, well, if this is the case, if we can make demonstrably falsifiable truth claims, and we demonstrate that those are false, that doesn't mean that you have to abandon, let's say, your broader tradition. We just have to understand maybe it in a different way. So let's reevaluate where we're at and understand what the text actually is, so that you can have a different sense of it or a deeper sense of it. Okay, so circle back, So that's a little bit background on what the Bible is, and so now we'll go to more. We'll try to get into, not quite what does the Bible say about homosexuality, because first we got to do the other preface, So what is homosexuality? A lot of people are very aware or already know the answer to this question, but anyway, we should still talk about it and put a little bit background and context on this too. So now, where we're at, in the course of my lifetime, it's now primarily understood in the context of sexual orientation, as it's called. So through a combination of genetics, prenatal environmental factors, maybe hormones, every human is born with a sexual orientation, which can be seen along a continuum. Sexual orientation is different from gender, and we'll make the point then that gender is also, as we're now becoming increasingly aware, I think all of us, is also a spectrum. So we'll just talk about sexual orientation here. The majority of people, obviously, and actually vast majority of people, are born with a innate heterosexual orientation, and that is to say, they naturally have romantic and physical attraction to members of the opposite gender. And because the numbers are so big, it's and society is kind of focused on, you're always focused on your own perspective no matter what. It's always been very hard for the people in the supermajority group to imagine how anybody else, is operating, because it's so naturally a part of your existence. But however, a small but significant minority of the population, and I try to get numbers way back in Kinsey's day, they've made I think, dramatic claims of saying maybe 10%, as much as 10% of the people might be LGBT in some way, and that seems very high based on what the different studies that have occurred now. So perhaps it's 3.4% of the adult population. That was a Gallup study. There was another study I read that says more like the same numbers. It could be more than that, or because people don't all, even if you have, let's say, gay orientation, you may certainly not report that. You may not want to tell anybody about it. You may not even want to admit it to yourself. And so in that case, the number can be higher than what we're able to identify through studies. So that proportion of the population then is naturally born with multiple different ones, but including a homosexual orientation, which is to say romantic and physical attraction to members of the same gender. So here's the complexity that we're now becoming increasingly aware of, right? So if we're going to say, on the one hand here, your gender, there is maybe a spectrum potentially where you are identifying as either all the way male or all the way female, or there's other options and possibilities, though. For example, people who are intersex, people who are asexual, people who are transgender. So anyway, so there's other those options in terms of your own gender, and then also attraction. And so essentially the idea on this is that if you are, a man and you're attracted to men, you have homosexual orientation, right? Okay. So orientation then, as we just kind of mentioned here, is different from identity. So although people have had inborn homosexual orientation in all cultures throughout time since prehistory, so it's every culture, despite the fact that many cultures don't think so, don't think that this is the case, it'll still be the case in terms of biologically, genetically, and in actual orientation terms. The existence of the orientation has really only been understood really since the later 20th century. And the new understanding that we have has allowed many people with that orientation to publicly identify as gay men and lesbians, like myself, for example. However, not everybody, as I mentioned, with that orientation is in the euphemism out of the closet, and that can be not only to others, so they might be reluctant to tell anybody about this minority orientation and try to pass, as the majority, or they may not be willing or able to admit it to themselves, or they may be hiding it from themselves for various reasons. And so, in fact, in the gay community, one of the additional burdens often is that there's a bunch of, let's say, guys who have really repressed their sexual orientation and are then also quite obsessed with it, and then get, let's say, hyper religious and zealous in opposing and being anti-gay. Yeah, Shaheen. One sec, Shaheen.
A while back, a psychological study was done in which a number of men were gathered, and then their homophobic responses were ranked.
Okay.
So they were rated as to how homophobic they were. And then they were later after that, they were exposed to homoerotica or gay porn.
Yeah.
And the level of excitement was physically measured.
Okay.
And it turns out that the more homophobic their responses, the more excited they were.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's a wonderful correlation. And it has been a real great benefit throughout history, as there's been a bunch of guys who have really decided that this is their thing that they want to be interested in or obsessed with. And sometimes you wonder, why is that guy so obsessed with this particular topic? Why does he always talk about it? And that's kind of a thing. So in terms of how this all developed, I don't know. Maybe why this would be. A lot of people think, well, genetically, how does this make any sense? Don't your genes need to propagate and things like that? If you're gay like me, I'm not going to have it. You can have kids, but you might not, and I'm not having any kids. So how is that going to work? Won't that just always dead end and go away? And so one of the possibilities is, as we understand, not everything that is going on. We are very self-focused, and we really think of us. Whereas I think like all of our genes are less interested in particularly who they're riding around in, on the one hand, and then in fact there is also the fact that we are part of traditionally kin groups and tribal groups and things like that. And so one explanation that I've heard that I always like is that for women, if they have gay brothers, it is a very big survival benefit for their kids, because essentially you have uncles that are around to help provide for that kid, when maybe that deadbeat dad that they actually have is not, anyway less helpful and that kind of thing. Anyway, having more people around, and then in general better for the tribe in general, because you have people who maybe are more worried about the tribe than they are worried about, let's say, their own individual kids, because they're less focused on that. And so that certainly, anyway, one of the things we're going to have, Shaheen is going to be able to comment on that. So whether or not that's the case, that's something that I've always anyway heard.
No, it's a great theory, and another thing that ties into it is the theory of why women experience menopause, right?
Yeah.
Because if it was genes just wanting to propagate themselves through you,
right,
then older women wouldn't need menopause to just keep having their own kids. But at some point, it was your genes kind of figured out that it was worthwhile investing in your kids' kids,
right,
as opposed to your own after a certain age.
Right. Good point. So, all right. So it's more complicated than when people first thought of how genetics work, let's say, and we're emphasizing individual survival, and ultimately that went down this whole social Darwinism thing that people had these ideas about in the 19th century that hopefully we're getting past. So, okay. So we talked about then orientation, we talked about identity, now also we have activity, so heterosexual and homosexual activity. So it should probably be very understood, but people I think have been nervous about it for a whole long time, that men with heterosexual orientation can have sex with other men without any effect on their orientation. So just because you're a guy and you're having all this sex with other guys, that does not make you gay. in terms of your orientation, even though people have been worried that it does for a whole long time. And you maybe be asked, why do you keep doing that? I don't know. You can be open to that kind of question. People, anyway. But anyway, it doesn't have an effect. Heterosexual men often, when you ask why are they doing it, well, okay, so one reason is, throughout history, is when they're in a community where women are very, very scarce or unavailable. So we're very well aware of this phenomenon in prisons, for example, Navy ships, people are pretty aware of this, monasteries. Also in societies that are more successful at not having, let's say, dating and things like that, so that where women are, you can't interact with women, and there's no chance of premarital sex and that kind of a thing. In that case, so there'll be Middle Eastern societies, for example, even though don't necessarily believe in gay people in terms of an orientation, there is perhaps in some cases more gay sex happening because essentially young straight guys are not able to interact with, and have sex with women. So it doesn't make them gay. So it's homosexual activity. And so likewise, it should go without saying then the opposite direction is that people with natural homosexual orientation throughout history can marry, men can marry women and then raise heteronormative families. And throughout time and societies where, let's say, marriage was more about, let's say, conveying property or kin group and things like that, and less about the more recent issues and interests in romantic love and things like that. It was quite normal, let's say, for a person or a couple to marry and not necessarily have an arranged marriage and not necessarily be fond of each other, and that wouldn't be any different, right? So in that case, then, throughout time, those people who nevertheless have, men and women, who have homosexual sexual orientation wouldn't be visible in the society, right? So no way to pick it out. And so one of the things then, as we see about it, even though people look back in time and then we see movies like, 300, it seems pretty gay, so I don't know, anyway. But, what the ancient Greeks are doing, so the elite men who are having same-sex relationships as a cultural thing, there is no, that's not any more higher percentage of the population. It's still going to be like 3.5% of the population who have homosexual orientation. It's by far, therefore, the overwhelming majority of the men who are engaged in those relationships have heterosexual orientation. So it has nothing to do with this orientation question. So that all seems clear? Okay. So, okay, now we circle back after the two prefaces, and now we're going to have to actually read verses, I think. I hope not. Anyway, I guess we do. We'll see. Oh, no, we do. We have more things to say. Okay, all the biblical authors, I'm just going to point out here, are ignorant of this thing that we just took for granted and understand without too much problem, right? So this idea of sexual orientation, it's only been understood recently. No one in biblical times, and biblical times is a long period of time if you count the New Testament in addition to the Old Testament, was aware of the existence of sexual orientation. So as a result, no author of any text that's included in the Bible has anything to say about actual homosexuality, which is to say the sexual orientation, right? Because they're not aware of inborn same-sex orientation. They have, all ancient societies or all societies know something is going on. They don't know what's going on, or why it's going on, or why, some people are so interested in what's going on, even if they don't, if they seem to be against it. So anyway, so biblical authors then are aware of homosexual activity, and a few of them write about it, and almost everything they write about it is not pleasant, but all of their views have to be then read in the context of their ignorance of sexual orientation. So, some of these guys are saying, yuck, they don't like that, this is impure, this is causing ritual impurity, this is an abomination. And some of these guys are kind of writing, why am I constantly tempted with this? Everybody seems to be tempted by, wanting to have sex with guys, and it's how does people fight this thing off? And you wonder why they keep asking about it. Yeah?
And why wouldn't they take the next logical step and infer the presence of sexual orientation one way or the other.
So the question is, why didn't anybody kind of come up with this
Yeah.
as an idea and understand about it? So
I would assume that
Go
all
ahead.
of the authors and everyone else certainly understood of the existence of it.
So
or
they
knew
understand the existence
of
of the activity.
it. And what is that based on, if not something like orientation?
Well, you can come up with all kinds of
Doesn't know
theories.
what
So- yeah, the question is, so the question's a valid one, right? So it seems like to us, because again, like I kind of said, when we cross a threshold of ideas and we have a new paradigm and we understand something, it's so natural. So we understand, it's such a natural or understandable explanation about why some people are interested in this and some people aren't. But again, until you get across that, just because we know it and it's obvious to us, everybody that's on the other side of before they came up with that idea, even if this idea, not all of our ideas are inventions. Sometimes our ideas are better explanations about something that is happening naturally, right? So at a certain point now, we think of, let's say, all species as evolving, and we think of those species as working on filling, or not, or they're surviving because they are filling particular environmental niches and things like that. We say, oh, that's very well adapted to that particular environment. We were hanging around on our balcony. We live just up the street on the 24th floor of an apartment building, and we are watching how all the hawks are helping out with the pigeons. And so they fly around and they scream and the pigeons go nuts. And we're saying how neat it is that the hawks are proving to be so adaptable of now being able to live in the city. They live in all the buildings and everything like that. And so essentially we think of that as a terms of how adaptable an hawk is to its environment that it's encountered with, and so therefore it's likely to survive and propagate. And if it could do that, we can see how well squirrels are doing. And so in other words, if those kind of, and rats and other things, if hawks can, and pigeons, if hawks can also do that, we'll have lots and lots of hawks for the foreseeable future. But anyway, I'm just saying we think of it that way because we are very aware of the idea of natural selection, because we're on this side of Darwin, right? Before that, you think, well, what were people doing for the previous 5,000 years? How were they not understanding that that's how it was happening? So to them, they very naturally, or their assumption was, because speciation happens so slowly, they just assumed that each category of animal is its own category that has always existed. So there has always been hawks, and a hawk is a completely different thing from a falcon, frankly, which is, I can't even tell them apart or whatever, because I'm not pay enough of attention to them. But anyway, and they're a very different thing and a completely separate thing from an eagle or any other thing. So in other words, they've always been hawks. And that's the way they were created. And so they had to actually come up with the question as a question that nobody was able to solve: which came first, the chicken, or the egg? And in the past, people really thought the answer to that was chicken. So in other words, there was a chicken at some point, it was created, and then eggs came from that chicken. Whereas now, I think we understand that, in fact, there's eggs, and eggs have gone back for a whole long time, and eventually the eggs are, essentially now we have chickens that have come from those eggs or whatever, but essentially the eggs were there first. So, not chicken eggs, because they were the preceding thing that, the chickens have evolved from, right? Okay. So why didn't they think of that? So they had a bunch of different other explanations about what this would be about. And so because I would say that one of the main reasons is that because it's fairly natural enough for people with heterosexual orientation to engage in homosexual activity. There's lots and lots of animals, or dolphins and everybody are doing that very naturally. Whether the dolphin, it's not just the dolphins that that have same-sex orientation, that are engaged in that kind of play. And so because that's happening, we saw that the culture, we see it both, like you say, in the community of of male-only communities like armies and navies, and also monasteries, also prisons. Likewise, it's just something that we saw like in ancient societies, like the Greeks and Romans, is quite, again, common, right? And so as a result of that, for the whole supermajority of people, so we're talking about 96% of the population, it would never occur to them that this thing that they were doing when they were a kid, before they got serious and got married and did their duty and raised a family and all this kind of thing, and ceased to be as interested and worried about sex as they really were when they were 17 and all this kind of thing. They don't think of that as just being something that you are. It's something that you did as a phase when you were a kid, or that you were tempted by, or whatever it was. So I think that it was quite reasonable for people to jump to that kind of a conclusion, or they had all kinds of other explanations about why anybody was feeling anything. So there's a force that's outside of you that's acting on you. So some god has tempted you, eros or lust or anything like that, or the devil. In other words, you have had desires that are coming from an outside force that's acting on people, and they make those explanations because those were also common. There's a comment or a question.
Yeah, this is actually a comment about, I guess, homosexual relationships in ancient Greece.
Yeah.
Which you said that they might have viewed it as a phase. I think that among like aristocratic Greek males, when they took like a younger lover, it was expected that later on they would put the affair aside and get married.
That's right.
When they entered public life.
You're right.
So, and that didn't really affect their, I guess, self-image as
right.
largely heterosexual. So it just has a lot to do with the way that different societies conceive of sexual relationships.
Right.
So
yeah,
I
and so
just
like
wanted
you
to
say,
make that
in
comment.
those circumstances, in that culture, there is no reason at all for, like they said, this 97% of the population to think that, that what they understand, homosexual activity, has anything to do with innate orientation, since their innate orientation is heterosexual. You had a comment. Esther also had a comment. Thank you for switching chairs.
Also, too, I remember reading something. Am I talking to a microphone? Can you guys hear me? Okay,
Yeah.
cool. I think also, too, class dynamics played a role as well in these kind of contexts, because I remember reading how in Roman law, the paterfamilias, like the head of the house, he had sexual access to his slaves, male and female, and it was expected that out of his property, he could have sex with his male slaves, and it wasn't seen, it was just seen as like using your property. Like it wasn't even seen as like having a relationship or anything like that. So there's even questions too of like, how do you understand the person? How do you understand how the person existed as a person and so on as well? So there's even class dynamics in those contexts too, right?
Yeah, so specifically, like you say, so the Romans who have a different view of it than the Greeks do. The Roman idea, we still have some of this bias in where, because we inherited so much from Rome conceptually, but the Roman idea is essentially real men penetrate, women and the feminine is to be penetrated, real men are dominant and all these kind of things. And so it literally doesn't matter at all for a Roman gentleman, who he is penetrating. Or what, or anything, because that is what you do, you know what I mean, and that kind of a thing. And so it was not seen in any way, as being. So we have all kinds of things also that we kind of tie up with what we think of in terms of the homosexual orientation and identity and things like that. You could be, you as a Roman man, you could have that, you could have that identity either way. But essentially, if you were then also though, the problem for the Romans is way less so, like you mentioning about with the Greeks. A young Greek aristocrat, Alcibiades, could be having an affair where he is the passive partner to Socrates, and that's quite an honorable thing that you can tell people about for the rest of your life. When you grow up and things like that. For the Romans, to have ever been the passive partner is seen as really unmanly and really bad, and so Julius Caesar, it was rumored, had that relationship like that with the king of Bithynia, so one of the important client kings of a Roman kingdom in what's now Turkey. And so one of the things that just caused a huge shame for Caesar when he had his military victory and he's marching through through the city of Rome. It should be his great day of triumph and everything like that. And his soldiers saluted him with the phrase, Ave Caesar Regina Bithyniae, which is to say, Hail Caesar, Queen of Bithynia. And so, this is a huge, that's like, so for that was a, there's nothing you do. But anyway, it was a, it was very shameful for it. So they have that kind of idea. We have in our biases now, we have the idea that homosexual orientation in men is equated with or associated with effeminacy. The ancient Greeks had exactly the opposite idea, although they didn't understand our orientation, but they definitely felt that if you were, in terms of homosexual activity, they didn't know anything about orientation, but if you were hanging around women or too interested in having sex with women, you would tend to become effeminate because they would want you to wash and wear perfume and whatever. You'd go and be in womanly pursuits, whereas if you could hang out with the guys and have sex with them, you would be really manly. And so the manly guys, the real tough guys and smelly guys are the ones that are, having a lot of gay sex, so that's how it would work. Yes, you have.
Sorry, I saw the ad in Now Magazine for tonight.
Yes.
I was just wondering if you could introduce yourself.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. So before the other introduction, so my name is John Hamer, and I am serve on the one hand as pastor of the Community of Christ Toronto congregation who's building Centre Place. This is Toronto Centre Place. I also serve as the coordinator of this meetup. My background is in history, although it's primarily in medieval history, but I also studied ancient Roman and Greek history as well and at the University of Michigan, and I went from there into academic publishing, so that's kind of my background. Okay, so biblical authors, some of them are, although they're all ignorant about orientation, some of them, however, they're very aware of homosexual activity, just like the Greeks and Romans were aware of it, and a few of them wrote about it, but and all of their views then have to be in that context, right? So I'm going to say, as a pastor, just as errors of biblical authors who are ignorant of things like the Earth's sphericity, so the initial worldview of the prophets of the earliest parts of the Old Testament is essentially they believe in a flat Earth that has four corners, that has a hemisphere dome on top of it, and above that is chaotic waters, and below that, below hell underneath, or the Sheol underneath, is also chaos waters. That worldview turned out to be incorrect. That's how they understood it based on, it's not science, but anyway, the natural philosophy and explanations and mythological explanations that they'd had up until that time. But just because they may have written that, we have to, again, understand them for their limitations, capacity, their own historical context, and understand the message that they have based on that. So in the same way that we don't think, most of us, I don't think that the earth is flat based on a couple passages of the Bible. We know it's spherical, and people, Jews and Christians and Muslims throughout history have known that. The statements are made in ignorance, and they should likewise be dismissed as error when they're talking about it. So I'm already dismissed them all before I even gave you a quote from the Bible. So with that, we'll actually hit some of these. So from the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, Old Testament for the Christians, we'll just talk about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, then we'll talk about the wonderful Levitical prohibitions, and then we'll get to the New Testament where we'll talk about Paul's long sets of musings that he has and why maybe he has those, and then other statements in the New Testament that are probably all about Paul, and then we'll just say, what does Jesus have to say on the subject? So the myth of Sodom and Gomorrah comes from the J source, as we say it, or the Yahweh source. So we've had lectures previously on the documentary hypothesis of how the 5 books attributed to Moses were assembled. This is the most robust explanation that literary critics of the Bible have been able to come up with to explain how we understand these underlying source texts. Essentially, you will get to different places in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and suddenly you will hear different language being used. And some of the authors have very particular ways that they write, and then that stops, and you hear this other, very separate and different voice, and then you come back to the other voice. And it's all interspliced and spliced all together in kind of a crazy way. And so this is understood then to be, at some point later, an editor has gone through and combined separate texts. It would be as if for Christians, if we were to take the 4 Gospels that we currently have, and you do what sometimes is called a harmony of the Gospels, where you splice them all up, you put them in kind of the order you think, and you just put them each one after the other, and it would essentially be one book, and you wouldn't realize that there had originally been 4 books, right? And as a result of that, you would have a lot of duplicated stories, where the stories are told in duplicate and triplicate. And the Sodom and Gomorrah story is actually one of those stories that has a complete duplicate. So it's told later in a completely different context. The same strange thing happens where people come to a town, and the people, anyway, we'll talk about the stories. Anyway, so this is a compilation. When we want to look then, if we're going to understand any of the stories, we have to look at who was the author and when, so that we understand the author and their context. So the J author is where we find the myth of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the J author is probably the oldest component of the 5 of the different source texts that make up the Pentateuch. So probably dates to the period after the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel. So if you remember that Israel had been split, the northern 10 tribes and essentially the lower 2 tribes. The Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom in 720, and then there's a period then when the southern kingdom comes into its own, it flourishes, and there's a vast amount of literary writing, and this is where almost all of the texts that we have of the earliest parts of the Bible come from. And so because of all this writing that takes place in that time period, then before the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem. So this author, the Yahwist author, the J source, is generally the most compelling of these authors. People can like different ones. Some people maybe like the E author, but the J author is the one who's telling stories like Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and some of these very memorable stories. So also this is where the Sodom and Gomorrah story is. So according to the story, as it's now in Genesis 18 and 19, 2 angels visit Abraham's nephew Lot, who lives in the city called Sodom. And before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed a house round, both young and old, and all the people from every quarter. And they called unto Lot and said unto him, where are the men that came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them in the biblical sense, right? So that we may have sex with them. So although these original Sodomites in the story are technically talking about gang raping male angels, the idea that the activity here is male-male, I'm going to argue, is way less relevant than the main point, which is that this city has failed to respect the ancient, especially in the Middle East, but anyway, all across the ancient world, guest-host relationship to the extent that the citizens are intent on gang raping their guests. And indeed, Lot tries to entice, tries to get them to not think of the angels by, offering a daughter to have instead, to commit atrocities on. And that happens in the duplicated story as well. In the duplicated story, what ends up happening is that the priest who has a female slave actually gives the slave and actually out to the men of the city, who end up raping and killing her, or almost to death, but then she dies. And so it's in that case, again, it's a story that's told twice in the Bible, and in the one instance, they're pretty indiscriminate about who they're doing this horrible thing to. So Valerie has a comment.
I'm just wondering why they use the device of referring to the city as a she, sort of like a ship, and her daughters, because it seems that that's not really pertinent in this case. I'm thinking too, like in Revelation, how Rome is referred to as
a she.
As a she. Is that like conventional, or is it
putting
women down, or what?
Yeah. So what I was going to say is, so what ends up happening here is, you're going ahead to the next passage, and so I'm going to suggest here that, so I'll address the question. Okay, so Ezekiel, who's going to talk about this story, is talking about Sodom, and he calls Sodom the city, she, and her daughters, which is to say the inhabitants. And so it's harder for us in English to get a sense of gendered nouns because we just don't do that. But I mean, it's in almost all languages, nouns have gender, and often cities are female and lands are female, which is why for many countries we'll call it the motherland. So the country is also a gendered female, but it doesn't have to be, because, for example, for the Germans, they call their homeland the fatherland, right? And so it just depends, I think, on what the urbs in Latin is female gender, and so Rome, therefore, is personified as a female deity, and so that would be true for a lot of ancient cultures and cities, but some of them would have it the other way, where the city would be a man. So in this case, Ezekiel is understanding Sodom to be, as he's talking poetically, the prophets are also poets, and so as he's talking poetically about Sodom, he's saying she and her daughters. This is how he's understanding, he interprets that story. So he is also an ancient writer, an ancient prophet, but he's writing just after the fall of Jerusalem. So it's later, and now reading this story, this is how he interpreted it and how it's widely interpreted by the other prophets at that time. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me, saith the Lord. So before the Lord. So the focus here is, right, they're doing all of these, they're not doing guest host things. They are not helping the poor and the needy. In other words, this is the reason for, as they're interpreting that. It's later interpreted by the end of the Second Temple period, by even Jesus' time. Early Christians are interpreting this story not as guest hosts, which is less important to them, and instead now, because of being part of Hellenistic society, where the Greeks are having a lot of this male cultural thing at the elite level, the people who are the culture, the culture of the Judeans at this point now, are identifying this practices as being foreign to them. Because, in other words, this is a common thing. It's a practice in the gymnasiums and things like that in all of these Greek or Hellenized cities that have been planted all around the Middle East, including like Alexandria, Egypt, and everything like that. So in other words, in all of these cities, this is part of the norm now. And so because this has come in, the locals have decided that this is a foreign thing. This isn't our thing. As the English will say, this is the French disease, right? And then the French said it was the Italians. And the Italians said it was the Greeks. It was the Greeks. But anyway, so they don't have any, they can't blame anybody. But anyway, so that's just normal. So, okay. So this word then became, the story became interpreted that way, and then in English the word becomes associated with homosexual activity, although in a technical sense it means, in the legal sense, I think, in how sodomy was used, it means pretty much any non-vaginal intercourse. The biblical story, anyway, it acquired that interpretation by the New Testament times. Okay. Okay, next. So I'm discarding Sodom and Gomorrah. I don't think that's about homosexuality or even homosexual sex. So there we are. Next, Levitical prohibitions in the P source. So one of the other sources, so we talked about the J source, one of the other sources is the priestly source. The priestly source is the most verbose, the boringest part of the Bible. So the priestly source is the part where the text starts to just drone on and on about how many ephods and how many, what the items are, how do they assemble the different vehicles inside the temple in order to have proper rituals and all this kind of thing. So the priestly author is wildly concerned with everything from rituals, vessels, sacrifices, things like ritual impurity. The priestly author is almost certainly a Zadokite priest or an Aaronid priest. In other words, a person who claims or believes that he is a descendant of Aaron, the high priest and brother of Moses, and also then from Zadok, who is the high priest under King David. And so they call themselves then Zadokites, or ultimately we say in the New Testament times Sadducees. And so it's of that clan. And so the priestly author is very concerned with those kind of things. Probably writing as the last of the last of the source texts that get made into the Pentateuch, either shortly before the destruction of Jerusalem in 587, or sometime during the exile, or sometime right after they get back. So later than the J source. So the priestly author is a source of two most widely quoted condemnations of homosexual activity in the book of Leviticus, among all of the hundreds of prohibitions that are there. And they are, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman, it is an abomination. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death. Their blood is upon them. So those are the very, very strong condemnations that exist within the Levitical text from the priestly author. This is written as though the priestly author is writing law as though this is delivered by Moses. In fact, we know it's written, as we say, hundreds of years after that. It's written as though it were talking to the tribes prior to entry into the land as they are wandering around Israel. In fact, it is essentially all of the prohibitions and all of the different laws that the leaders of the temple cult in Jerusalem would like to highlight for ritual purity. So these are things that applying essentially initially to that priestly caste almost exclusively and practice, but ultimately over time as rabbinic Jewish identity, for example, became much more focused on having everybody participate in and obey priestly ritual purity and other kinds of priestly laws. Ultimately became more mainstreamized into to rabbinic Judaism. So, but it wouldn't have been until really even after, let's say, New Testament times. So as of the New Testament, it's only a very small fraction of Jewish people who would be, let's say, following all of the different laws, and most of them were arguing with, and most of them were wanting that viewpoint, were starting to formulate that as a basis of the religion that had previously been focused on the temple cult and the priestly cult and sacrifice and things like that. When the temple is destroyed by the Romans, the next temple is destroyed. We end up having a new version of the religion because it can't be focused on the temple since the temple's gone. There's a question that Chuck has. Do we have? Wait 1 second, Chuck. You got to get the microphone.
Remember in a course that I had once, we were told that the word abomination originally did not have the negative connotation that it now carries, that in fact it just meant not of our tradition. So that it was not judgmental. I don't know how factual that is.
So I'm given to understand, so this is, obviously abomination is our one of our English translations for the word. I am not a Hebrew scholar. My ancient language is Latin, and so anyway, so what we have is my understanding is I've read the underlying word. There were multiple words in Hebrew that have gotten translated over time as abomination in the English. The particular one here is one that is used especially for idolatry, and so this is in a whole long list of different things about not worshiping idols, for example. So like I say, the authors of this law are the priests, the leaders of the priesthood in the temple in Jerusalem. The word main meaning is, I had it back here, is ritually impure. So ritual purity is really important in terms of what the priests are able to do. So we have a little of that understanding of it in the Christian parable of the Good Samaritan, where the priest and the couple people anyway. But anyway, people who were, the priest and the Pharisee both don't want to come in contact with a corpse, which they think the Samaritan is, not the Samaritan, they think the wounded person is a corpse, because if they do, they'll become ritually impure. They won't be able to go to the Sabbath and things like that, right? And so there is it's a big long list of things that are considered ritual impurities. And part of that context also for these laws, so the reason why they may be included here, and this is in some ways speculative, but anyway, some scholars suggest that one of the reasons why it may well be on the particular laundry list that we find it in is that really up until the destruction of the temple, just a few generations before the destruction of the original temple, not the second temple. So when this Leviticus law is being written, the temple under King Manasseh, who had been one of the predecessors to King Josiah, when there is this major reform and all of the Deuteronomic laws, Deuteronomy gets found, and there's all of these kind of new emphasis on the law. Up until that time, there were all sorts of idols in the Jerusalem temple. Leandro had a lecture on this. There was all sorts of polytheism, that is essentially regular pagan practices that are happening, and among those were, as it says in the Bible itself, among those were pagan prostitution, so temple prostitution. Both male and female temple prostitutes were at the Jerusalem temple then, within the kind of like just in a couple generations of when this law would have been written. And so it's possible that what they're saying here is we are expelling, let's say, the non-monolatrist, proto-monotheist practices, as we are getting rid of the different worship of all the different gods. One of the things that is not going to be part of Yahweh's practice, one of the things that is not going to be part of the new religion that we are having here, First Temple Judaism, is not going to be temple prostitution anymore. So we're getting rid of men lying with men as with a woman. So, Valerie. I'm sorry. Thank you, Urgent.
Yeah, the death penalty there on the bottom line, like in our eyes, that sounds like it's therefore a really, really big deal and very bad because we have the death penalty for so few things in our society. But I'm wondering, like, you know, if it's like you're saying about a ritual impurity and there were strong, I take it, laws against that, would there be like parallel examples of other impure acts that would merit the death penalty? Like, I don't know, eating a pork sandwich while sitting in the temple waving about an idol, or adultery,
if
adultery.
Somebody who's not allowed to go into the temple sanctuary were to go in there, then that is also, you know, a death penalty offense, right? So there was even up until the New Testament times, there's when the temple is technically within the Roman Empire, there is nevertheless a sign that says Gentiles can't go any further here, you know, on penalty of death, right? So there is those kind of things, like you say, for desecration. It's also an ancient law code. Antiquity, they don't have. We just very cavalierly, or especially in the United States, very cavalierly put people in prison all the time because there's a bazillion prisons, and it's very easy to do that. They really don't have any prisons, and prison's a very ad hoc thing all the way up to modern times. And so ancient law codes were you cut the hand off, then, you know, this kind of thing. I mean, in other words, you don't have any prison that you can stick people in for the next 40 years because no one has that kind of luxury. So they will kill people, or they would exact fines, or you would potentially have corporal punishment. And so that's much more common in ancient law codes generally. And yes.
Hello. So this is fascinating. So according to possibly some fundamentalist Christians who don't advocate or affirm homosexuality, they'll take this Leviticus scripture and they'll listen to the arguments of people who are pro-homosexual. And they'll say, so for example, how this is under the law, so we dismiss it for today. And that pro-homosexuals would say, because it's under the law, then we can do away with it. Okay, so some fundamental Christians would say, well, so was having sex with an animal. So they would argue, and so my question to you would be just afterwards, they would argue that because, I know you guys are tracking with me, because we don't today advocate or permission people to have sex with animals, we still think that's an abomination or something's wrong with that. The Christians fundamental Christians would argue because that has transferred and we don't necessarily today think that's normal.
Yeah.
What would be the reason that it's not?
Why we can't have sex with animals.
Well, if we can't have sex with animals today, because if we think that's abnormal, why then do we think if homosexuality is permissible to the Lord? Anyone following me here? Because I'm having a hard time. I know what I want to see, but I can't.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I can try to address your question.
I really want to get it out. It's like
okay.
So they'll say, okay, so I'll just say, but Leviticus is saying this, it was under the law. Yeah. So these guys that are pro-homosexual are saying it's under the law, so we can do it, so it doesn't exist. So homosexuality is okay today. But what are they going to say about animals?
Right.
When they're having sex with animals, we're going to say that now it's okay, we can have just sex with animals because it's under the same law. So they would argue that they would argue that it's okay, that they would argue that our argument that homosexuality is okay because it was under the law, is a terrible argument because also what was under the Leviticus law was having sex with animals.
Right.
But now common sense is like we would think maybe that's not cool. So how do we argue to the fundamental Christians who counter our argument that it was under the law by their arguments stating that having sex with animals is
right.
I could have wrote this down.
I totally get it. I get what you mean. I completely understand you. So don't worry. So, thank you. So,
John, it's all. I'm not sure how many more slides we have left.
We're okay. We're doing.
Yeah,
good.
we're okay. Okay.
Yeah.
But that's a fascinating question that I think should have also.
So
we should revisit that question later during the
okay,
Q&A.
I'm going to answer the question right.
Sure.
So the question is, how can we? Okay, so if Leviticus also prohibits bestiality, and we are now saying that, oh well, that's Leviticus. I think I actually have the next slide. It's going to be like this, right? Okay, so if we are going to say as Christians nowadays, and Marge is saying here, but Reverend, isn't that a sin? And Reverend Lovejoy said, Marge, everything is a sin. Have you sat down and read this thing? Technically, we're not even allowed to go to the bathroom, right? Right? Okay, so we have just more or less dismissed the law because we've said we've put divided context for those particular Levitical prohibitions. And so then why then do we prohibit, or how can we argue that it's wrong to have bestiality? And so for Christians, it's not a problem to be able to make that argument because you don't want to do things. The idea of the new covenant is not that we need a whole set of laws with thou shalt nots. We aren't going back to we're not having sex with animals because of Leviticus. We are not having sex with animals because the animal is not able to give consent. The animal is you are imposing your selfishness and this sort of thing onto animals. So this is a prohibition of essentially the heart of Jesus' teachings of do unto others and respecting the least of these and everything else. And so in the same way, animals then would fall under that, right? And so it's not something that we have to have the lists of thou shalt nots with 2,000 different commandments, because the idea of the Christian idea of this is we need to discern what's right, based on principles like that, and not based on, let's say, letter of law, but spirit of it. So I think we can avoid having sex with animals legitimately. So it's my hope. Anyway, so I'm going to argue, just in anticipation of your question, my slide here is exactly it. The Levitical law for Christianity technically isn't an issue at all. I spent a bunch of time on it, and I tried to explain one of the ways how we can understand it, because a lot of members of our community have a Jewish background or Muslim background. So in other words, just because Christians can get away from this pretty quick, Leviticus, we didn't want to leave everybody else in the lurch. And so the rabbis will tell you that the application of Levitical law is really only the people of Israel and probably only within that particular time period. It isn't something that is incumbent upon everybody who's a Gentile here. So although fundamentalist Christians, I think, are confused and ultimately I'm going to even say hypocritical here on this subject, Christianity is actually founded on a rejection of Levitical law. So we are not following all of these different things like the Reverend Lovejoy has. I mean, I'm eating shellfish. We are wearing mixed tweed or whatever. There's all of the, I have cheeseburgers, and, in other words, we're having milk and I turn on the lights on Saturday. I do not only rest on Saturday. In other words, all of the different prohibitions, all of the Levitical law, we are simply not following that, and Christianity hasn't been since it emerged as its own religion in the original schism between Christianity and Second Temple Judaism back just in the time of the apostles after Christ. So Christians don't practice Levitical law. The earliest Christian writer we have goes so far as to say, this is Paul, you who want to be justified by the law have cut yourselves off from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. If you go now and do all of the things of the law, if you go and, Paul says, if you go and have yourself circumcised, you might as well just say, it'll not only not do anything for you, it functionally means you're rejecting Christ. You're rejecting Christianity. And so that's a very strong formulation that he made, but it is completely consonant with essentially all of the ways that Jesus was operating, where he was healing people on the Sabbath or doing different things that were meant to be demonstrations that the law isn't what is important, that we follow it literally, but rather that we have a sense of the spirit of it. And in that sense, Christianity, in making that argument, we should not caricature Judaism or Islam. Christians tend to do that and say that Judaism is only rule-based and things like that. There is all kinds of place for deliberation, mercy, and all sorts of things within Judaism. Even if you were going to, let's say, go back to this and you are subject to this Levitical law and this death sentences, you also, according to the law, have to have two witnesses who caught them in flagrante delicto, and they have to testify and all these kind of things. And it's a very complicated standard for anybody to actually meet. So, and people won't do that generally. So, anyway, Christians can get out of the Leviticus ones pretty easy because we don't practice Levitical law. It has no bearing on Christianity. So Paul, so we mentioned Paul here in terms of him being one of the early formulators of this Christian theology. Who was he? He'd been a Pharisee. He'd been a practitioner of Jewish law, converted around the year 35 AD or CE, and became what is functionally a second founder of Christianity. It only became known as Christianity in his lifetime. At the lifetime of Jesus, it was not called that. Paul helped formulate this emerging Christian theology that rejects Levitical law. Unfortunately, he also is unusually interested in homosexuality. So if only he'd gotten rid of law and shut up, we wouldn't have to worry about this, but the lecture continues. Okay, so Paul has a very odd obsession with homosexuality. The traditional, by the time he's around now, traditionally Judeans or Jews, Second Temple Jews, had come up with this cause of gay orientation as essentially, they don't know about orientation anyway, the cause of being interested in homosexual activity is because it's a foreign influence, right? And so I've mentioned there are Hellenized cities all around, Greek cities. They see this as a foreign thing, and when they explain it, essentially the idea is that they've seen these naked Greek statues or something like that, and that somehow has caused them to go Greek crazy. And so, for example, we have here in Romans one of these passages of the Christian New Testament about homosexuality, exchanging the glory of immortal God for the image shaped like mortal man. As a result, God has given them up to shameful passions. Women have exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and men too burn with lust for one another. So he has this sense then that the cause of the temptation, as we were talking about before, what causes this in us. So he's saying Paul's theory here, and the general theory was foreign influence, but possibly here because the gods have such good statues, this kind of a thing. Shaheen, do you want to comment quickly? We have to be fast with the comments now.
I was just going to say that the whole unnatural intercourse and the idea of lust
Yep.
is maybe the idea of having sex solely for procreation.
That's right.
Which I think was really big in the Bible. So if you're having sex with someone you can't procreate with, then it's an abomination. Because even like, I mean, the withdrawal method was
Yeah.
condemned by the Bible, right?
So this is a good point. So one of the things, and this is kind of common in ancient thinking, so ancient people really got a sense often, and Aristotle has even been doing this all the time, that something is for something. And so as opposed to where we now are, where we understand evolution, where birds don't have wings in order to fly. I mean, it's not planned that way, right? So in other words, it ends up evolving because there was a series of adaptive strategies or whatever that ended up working. But for Aristotle, the more important thing was, what is a wing for? Flying. So in other words, the purpose. So every single thing, wings can't have, as far as you're concerned, since everything has a purpose, which is flying, then you can't have another purpose, which is maybe keeping you warm, or any number of other things, because you're so fixated on the one purpose thing. So you might well think, tongues are for, talking, but it may well be tongues are for tasting, maybe tongues are for licking, whatever. So in other words, so in fact, things actually have multiple purposes, and what it turns out is, even though ancient people in a lot of cases did have this start to have this sensation or thinking that sex is for procreation, it turns out that sex is for all kinds of things. And quite naturally so. And so that's just something that also is an ancient bias that is just inherent right here. And I also mentioned, we didn't get to mention this, but it would have been good if for people with a Jewish background, for lesbians, because in that entire list of all the different things that the priestly author wants to forbid, which really is a big long list, like Reverend Lovejoy was saying there, women having sex with women is not on that list. So it's something that the priestly author just never even could think of. He couldn't figure out how that would work, I guess. So anyway, it didn't get forbidden. But it does, unfortunately, for people who are Jewish, it does get forbidden by the rabbis. And so then Paul brings it up here too. You have a comment? Well, you have to have the microphone.
Thank you. I often find that evangelicals who are really selective literarists,
Yes.
in other words, they take the passages from the Bible literally, they select that.
Yes.
They discount the others where you talk about selfish or passages that support slavery.
Right.
But they will seize on those passages which see homosexuality as immoral, as an abomination.
Right.
Some literalists, perhaps you can comment on this, see this letter in Romans that Paul has written as a bridge between the Old Testament and the New Testament for their ongoing condemnation of homosexuality.
Yes. No, you're exactly right. In order to do that, no one who, like I say, because we are not, you can tell very clearly that no Christians, no matter what, fundamentalists are not obeying Levitical law thoroughly, because we know what that looks like, because we can see what Orthodox Jews are doing, right? And so it's simply not happening. So they are definitely, like you say, cherry picking, and they're picking the things out that they want to interpret literally. Again, what I can just quote in terms of like Paul, so they're using Paul here to say, Paul has very strong statements against that. Paul says, we are ministers of a new testament, a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter, which is the literal, brings death, but the Spirit gives life. So early Christianity is not about literal interpretation, it is in fact condemning that continuously. So this is unfortunately an issue, like you say. It's crazy that even though that's the entire purpose of the religion, people, it turns out, do like hard, fast rules. And they would like to and fall back on judging and coming up with a list of do's and don'ts and thou shalt nots and that kind of a thing. And that ultimately, I would say, is a rejection of actual Christianity. It's a rejection of Jesus' gospel. Nevertheless, Christians went right to it very, very fast. And so that has also been part of the tradition for thousands of years. But I would just argue that it's clearly at odds with the actual Christian gospel. So this is one of those passages, and Paul is talking about that. because again, he's very focused on it. We may wonder, why is he actually, though even bringing this up in this letter to the Romans? So this is his last letter, and he's writing it to the church in Rome because he's trying to get in on their kind of good side, and so that they will potentially, he's been kicked out of all of the eastern part of the Roman Empire by his enemies. His enemies, we can find out through reading the New Testament, are largely the apostles in the church in Jerusalem, essentially the people that are followers of James, the brother of Jesus, who are at odds with Paul and all of Paul's interpretations. And so what he's writing here to the people in the Church of Rome is, I had to leave all of my previous churches that I founded all around the Corinthians and all these other guys, and I'm intending to take a mission work now to Spain and create all new ones. But I'm hoping to stop in Rome, and maybe you guys will be able to contribute to my mission and more or less fund me. And so why then does he kind of make this kind of strange, again, as he's kind of making his big sum up of all theology, it's kind of strange for him to, again, come back here and go and dwell on this idea that, anyway, that people have all this same-sex lust. So I'm going to say, are you here? This is a case that we've made in another lecture. What if you're Jewish and you're born gay? So if you are, as we were asking, so Jane asked this. So if you are a straight, have heterosexual orientation and you're Jewish, this may make all the sense in the world. Those Greeks are looking at their statues and things like that. But if you're like Paul and you're somebody who has continuously obeyed the law, who you're not a pagan, you haven't learned it from those things, how is it that he might be suffering from all this same kind of lust that the pagans have because of their paganism? And so Paul, here in Romans, comes up with his own interpretation of this. And so he says, had it not been for the law, I should never have been acquainted with sin. For example, I should never have known what it was to covet if the law had not said, you shall not covet. Though the commandment, through commandment, sin found its opportunity and produced in me all kinds of wrong desires. So the law is what causes desires for Jews as far as Paul is concerned, and the law is the problem, which is one of the reasons why he is a rejecter ultimately of law, legalism, and this interpretations. So why, like I say, is he of this topic? If what we're going to find out anyway, given that Jesus is not saying a lot about this, so it's not a core part of the new movement of Christianity, why is Paul devoting so much thought in his magnum opus to the Romans? So in addition to this, Paul felt the need to explain why he, unlike other apostles, didn't travel with a wife. So normally all of the different apostles, Peter and everybody, take their wife around with them as their companion, but instead Paul always has younger male companions, Timothy, Titus, Silvanus, etc. So Paul also talks in his letter to Philemon's owner. He describes, Onesimus, I'm trying to think of how, Onesimus. Onesimus is the slave, the owner is Philemon. In the little letter to Philemon, he describes the slave as his beloved brother, both in the flesh and in the Lord. Paul confesses in Corinthians, a thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from being too elated. 3 times I sought the Lord about this, that it should leave me, but he said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So, anyway, we can't say, this is scholarly speculation. Many scholars have said there are lots of different ways where Paul here is potentially what he is doing is he's confused as to why people are constantly tempted with same-sex temptation, right? And he has become obsessed with this topic. Maybe this is the reason. We mentioned at the beginning that this is one of the, unfortunately, burdens that gay people have had to bear, is that there have been a bunch of gay people in history who, who aren't out to themselves or would like to, like to have this not be the case. And this sort of thing reads like it. We can't know. So, nevertheless, when we mentioned before that Paul's enemies, the Jamesian church, so the brother of Jesus, who is a leader of the church back in Jerusalem, their church is called in coded language the poor. And so Paul is often talking about how he's taking up a collection for the poor of Jerusalem. So essentially that church is what that's called. It's led by the brothers of Jesus. And in their letters, in their text, or not, it's not actually by them, but texts from that community that are ascribed to James and Jude. It's not written by the actual brothers. But anyway, the author of Jude writes to warn other Christians of certain intruders who have stolen in among you, who pervert the grace of our God into licentiousness. Jude compares them to those in Sodom, which in the same manner as they indulge in sexual immorality and pursue unnatural lust. So essentially, James is more or less saying that our enemies, anyway, many scholars argue these are the two sides of this war, the Paulists versus the Jamesians. James essentially and the Jerusalem church are more or less making anti-homosexual slurs against Paul. So further, he writes, these dreamers also defiled the flesh, reject authority, and slander the glorious ones. The Jamesian church doesn't want to reject law. So they believe in law and works. Paul says essentially wants to reject works and law and have a church focused on grace and spiritualism, not literalism. So although the dreamers in James's letter are unnamed, and so therefore it made it into the New Testament and didn't get edited out, which it certainly would have been because Paul's church ultimately won. The expansion of that letter in 2 Peter. 2 Peter is not written by Peter. It's a text that took the letter of Jude and expanded it and recast it as a new text, as if it was by Peter. It's also from the Jamesian church. It names them with coded phrases who these dreamers are, and it calls them Cain, Balaam, and Korah. So Korah's name in Hebrew is bald head. Cain is the ancestor of tent dwellers. So Paul, the one thing description we have on him is that he's bald. He's a tent maker. Moses' enemy Balaam had Israel act treacherously against the Lord by eating a food sacrifice before the gods of Moab. Paul argues that Christians are free to eat the meat of pagan that was sacrificed to pagan temples and things like that. So on all these ways, then, it's possible then these Jamesian are identifying the people who they are saying are indulging in the sins of Sodom and in general are getting rid of law. That same argument that the fundamentalists are making, they're making for Paul in general. Anyway, so there's this sense then that other people are also calling Paul gay or homosexual. They don't know about orientation, but they're saying that he has been tempted that way or that he's acted that way. Whether or not, there's no particular reason for us to think that based on Paul's own writings. I would think that it's more likely that he has this orientation and temptations which he's not acting on, right? And that's why he's having this kind of internal angst. Yes, we have a comment.
If Paul and James were so divided, as you're arguing, there were two separate churches, why did both men, James and Paul, along with Peter and the other disciples, all agree with each other at the Council of Jerusalem, as described in the book of Acts?
Yes. So the book of Acts, I would argue, it's written later than that. It's not written by an eyewitness. Yeah, we can talk a little. Well, this will be quickly. Landra's timing me that I can't go this slow. But anyway, and so what we can say about that is that because the author of Acts, which is also the author of Luke, is somebody from Paul's church, but who isn't, just to say, one of these Greek congregations, and probably doesn't have a Judean background, is not an affiliate of the Jamesian church. We are now long past the deaths of both Paul and James. We are now past the time when there's a threat between the two, and the new narrative that the author of Acts would like to portray is essentially how Christianity has spread and expanded. And so there's no particular reason or agenda to go back and say this is all our dirty laundry, but rather to say this is how we were able to recover from differences. We know about that council is actually from as Paul writes about it himself. And so because we have that, and it differs from from Luke's description, more or less what we have is that Paul made a deal, as he says, with the other pillars of the church in Jerusalem, the acknowledged pillars, Peter, James, and John. And that was that he could continue his mission among the Gentiles, but he'd take up a collection for the poor of Jerusalem, which is to say the Jamesian church. And that he was given to understand that it would be all right for him in that mission to not obey Levitical laws. In other words, he could not have to circumcise people. He could eat the two different peoples could eat. So Christians who are Jews, Christians who are Gentile wouldn't otherwise be able to eat with each other if they weren't all obeying Levitical law. Anyway, he understood that to be the deal. He later found continuously apostles from the Jamesian church were not honoring that deal as Paul understood it. And so he writes about that and complains bitterly about that to the Galatians and other people. So I would argue then that it's ongoing, and it's simply that Acts tells the story late and tries to de-emphasize all the conflict. But we get the conflict when we read Paul. Okay, and we're done. You're going to be happy. So anyway, what I'm going to argue then, anyway, what does Jesus have to say about homosexual activity? So he actually is saying nothing. He doesn't bring it up at all. So he doesn't say anything in particular beyond his general message of inclusion, and also, like I say, this message of not having legalism, but rather that we're ruled by the Spirit and by principle now instead of by literalistic rules. And that is the last slide. So thank you. Yes.
I'm going to snag the first question, just because I happen to be sitting near Ergan. So we know now that genes that are linked to homosexuality have been traced to a certain region on the X chromosome. We don't know exactly what their location is, but we know that they're on the X chromosome.
Yeah.
And it makes sense if you think about it from a genetic point of view, that the X chromosome, which is doubly inherited in females and singly inherited in males, would carry genes that would push you towards having sex with men. Because if you think about it from a woman's point of view, especially before the 19th century, with no anesthesia, no anesthetic, you had a 50-50 chance of dying in childbirth. And if you look at charts of women's lives and you look at like the death rate, like if you look at ages between 10 to say 40, the death rate spikes almost to 100%.
Yeah.
Because women would die in childbirth. And so in order to push you over this hurdle, you'd have to have something that drives you towards having sex with men.
Yeah.
Right? And if these genes are on there and they're X chromosome linked, then guess what? Guys get them too.
Yeah.
And it might be that some X chromosomes just carry stronger driving genes towards that.
Gotcha. That's neat. I hadn't heard that before. Valerie.
Yeah, in the last week, I picked up at the Subway publication, oddly enough, from the United States by a Christian fundamentalist group.
Yes.
And I was struck by their language around how much of a threat homosexuality is to the sanctity of the family.
Uh-huh.
And it's not just gay marriage, but just adultery, homosexuality, etc. And I know that there's nothing in the New Testament that's specifically against, that, or that makes that link, but it was not Augustine that said it's better to marry than to burn. They have prohibition against adultery. How is it that the American Christian fundies made this association that somehow, holy matrimony, the sanctity of the family is threatened by, well, A, gay marriage, but B, even homosexuality in particular? I'm just wondering, what your thoughts on that might be.
Yeah, so, I mean, they're not getting this out of, like, they just made that up yesterday. The context really then from the biblical period here, there is a lot more that ultimately ends up being, Paul is not only worried about gay sex, he's worried about sex in general, and he doesn't think it's particularly good. And it's really out of his writings that Christian clergy in the West, the Catholics, for example, are supposed to take oaths of celibacy and things like that. And in general, it was viewed all through, in the Christian West anyway, all through history, if you could avoid sex altogether, that would be the best. And so if you can do a thing where, I mean, actually the rhythm method was recommended because by this whole time period that you're spending not having sex, that's teaching you to, not have sex maybe the rest of the time. So in other words, the more that you can get to the point where you finally don't have sex at all anymore, as far as kind of where people were at, it's part of the overall sort of anti-physical thing that Christianity is sort of probably inheriting from this kind of Zoroastrian dualism, the kind of Manichaeism and things like that. So essentially Plato is even, the flesh is pretty bad. All the philosophers, the mind and spirit is what's good and elevated and light. And so if you are indulging in things that are carnal, whether it is, let's say, gluttony or getting drunk, or whether it is, having sex, all of these things are the implication of all these things is that you're not focusing on the spiritual. And so throughout all of Christian history, so it's not this recent time, but I mean Justinian, who is a Christian emperor, Theodosius, the first emperor who made Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire, outlawed passive sex. The Roman, again, they don't like passive gay sex, homosexual sex. And then Justinian, who a later successor, many centuries or a couple centuries later, outlawed both, penetrative and passive gay sex. Nevertheless, throughout all those centuries, Rome continued to license and collect the taxes on all of the male brothels, right? So Christianity has this fraught relationship where, on the one hand, there is the sense that you shouldn't be doing it, and it's sex in general is bad, like the holy saints and queens and things like that would just stop having, were the reason why Edward the Confessor, the last Norman king, the last Anglo-Saxon king, didn't have any kids because his saintly wife, he's a saint, and his saintly wife, they didn't have any, they have no kids because they're not having sex. So in other words, you would do that kind of thing and then enter monasteries where you would then continue to not have sex. And so that was a goal and an agenda item in the West. And so what ends up happening, though, I think as a result of that, is quite naturally, we talked about how when societies, let's say, become all-male societies, there's going to be more homosexual activity regardless of sexual orientation. So, this is the Navy, as an example, the British Navy or whatever, right? So it's very, it's just a well-known idea that, when they're not able to get to Singapore, there's going to be, homosexual sex happening. Well, that attracted, I presume, lots and lots of people lots and lots of young men who, let's say, did have same-sex orientation, even though they didn't know it, right? They might, maybe I'll go to the Navy. And that, I think, is also something that was happening throughout all of Christian history in terms of the clergy and monasteries. So if you had a kid, you kind of like, that one's kind of for God. This one's to go off and be a knight. And so they'd stick them in the monastery, or they'd send them off to be the priest and things like that. And so as a result of that, there is a weird relationship with, let's say, people with homosexual orientation and the clergy throughout Christian history. And likewise, there is between women and the church. So women in some ways are not, there's a patriarchal order, they're not able to be the leaders, and yet they're the people who are most connected to the church, right? And so anyway, for all of these kind of reasons, I would say, when the breakdown happened, and now all of the religious denominations in general are collapsing in the 20th century, we now have open understanding of sexual orientation and now acknowledged gay identity and lesbian identity. So now there's a kind of a breakdown between that traditional relationship and how previously those guys would have been in the church and leading the church. Now they're not, and the people who are still in the church are condemning that, right? And so anyway, once you can actually make the leap and get over it, and not be upset about it anymore, it turns out gay guys still like to come back to church, you know, and so here I am, right? So anyway, so when you can.
But why? I don't get the connection between, you know, what is really like a relatively small percentage of the population that has nothing to do with the condition of the family. Like there is a big breakdown of the family. The divorce rate is huge.
Right.
But I remember reading somewhere that 60+ divorces are actually initiated by women. So like you'd think the fundies would speak out against women's autonomy or something. Why are they blaming it on gays and gay marriage? That I don't get.
Well, I think they are upset about women's autonomy, and they are upset about being allowed to get divorced. You know, and so I think that also happens. So I think what happened is in this particular case is that it's on the one hand religious, but it's also there came to be in the 1970s especially an agreed upon set of American tribalism where they picked out a couple different things, including abortion, including homosexuality or whatever, and those things got hardened into being the list. It could have just as easily been anything else, right? And so, I think so. Yes, he has a comment or question. Probably why I'm wrong.
Just about this last slide.
Yes.
I think there's definitely some, regardless of if we think Jesus said anything about homosexuality in Scripture or not. Personally, I think I'd argue that in parts of Matthew where he talks about how a man must leave his mother and father to cleave to his wife, that is a pretty specific affirmation on what Jesus thinks the family is, especially when he also went to the wedding at Cana. But regardless of that, because that's in Scripture, we can't really say, well, what did Jesus say about homosexual activity? If we can explain those things away and say, oh, well, he didn't say any of that, therefore he didn't say anything against homosexual activity. But the Gospel of John, near the end of his Gospel account, says something to the degree of not everything that Jesus said has been written in this book.
Right.
So we can't really assume that just because it's not in the Bible, Jesus didn't say it.
Sure.
And then I can understand people now saying, well, how do you know what Jesus said if it's not in the Bible?
Right.
And I think the importance of that comes down to church tradition. I think also Paul says that when he says to the brothers, adhere to everything I've written to you by word or by the traditions we have passed down to you. So the traditions seem to be on the same level as Scripture.
Yeah.
And tradition, capital T tradition, you could say, has faithfully been preserved by the Catholic Church. And I think the churches authoritatively, with the authority Jesus gave to them, especially Peter in Matthew 16:18, and on the day of Pentecost to go and make disciples of all nations. I think the church has faithfully kept that tradition of renouncing all homosexual activity. And I think that's truthfully to the teachings of Jesus.
Okay. Well, so the argument, obviously, Christianity is in schism. Of course, the largest denomination within Christianity is the Catholic Church, and definitely within the Catholic understanding of Christianity, tradition, Scripture, the Apostolic Fathers, and the Apostolic succession. So the early, are all sources of authority. Obviously, that was a major point of contention between the church that remained headquartered in Rome and that continues to have that apostolic succession, and obviously all of the churches that have emerged from Protestantism subsequently. So so we have that. In general, with the different traditions, we have that disagreement. But I definitely respect the history and tradition of the Catholic Church. I'm a big student of Catholicism. I disagree with a lot of the ideas of it theologically, and I have a different perspective on Jesus, historical Jesus, and also on Christ theologically, but I mean, we're in different parts of the movement, and so I respect your interpretation. Yeah. Oh, Rudy.
I didn't know that Paul had written about female homosexuality, but as you said, that there's nothing in the Old Testament about females having sex with other females, which I was aware of.
Yeah.
And I've wondered if perhaps the writers of the Old Testament did not know that women have done this, that they do this. Would you think so?
Well, this is a problem when, I guess this is so, especially when all those prohibitions are coming from the priestly author, and the Levitical priests are men. It doesn't mean that there were no, holy women and prophetesses and judges and things like that who are women in ancient Israel. But the people who are in the temple cult and the Levitical Aaronic line, actually not Levitical, the Aaronid line, the Zadokite priests are all men, and they may be, when you have this all male thing, they oftentimes aren't thinking of women. And so then women, like you say, maybe were under the radar on that, so, yeah. And so, I'm sorry, there was a comment here, a question.
John, if, as you say, that there are so many different authors to the Bible,
yes,
so many contradictory views, in fact, is it safe to assume that really you can look for passages in the Bible to support almost anything you want to believe in, from the subjugation of women to the promotion of slavery to the condemnation of one's sexuality?
Absolutely.
And if that is the case, perhaps, just perhaps, we have to look beyond the literal truth of the Bible to its spiritual truth.
I can thoroughly agree with you. So yes, part of the problem is, since it's internally self-contradictory, since it makes, like you say, both those cases. So you talk about the subjugation of women. There are passages in Paul and in the letters attributed to Paul that are saying that women shouldn't speak in church, right? And so women have to obey their husbands or submit to their husbands. So this has become a very big thing in, let's say, dominionist Protestant fundamentalist churches, where there's a whole big ethic of women's submission that they have. But I would argue that writing at exactly that same time, in that same way that there's the Ruth and Ezra have those competing views right next to each other, we also have counter to that position of Paul's follower in Timothy, and the letter to Timothy, we have the author of Luke, who is making a point that when Jesus as a babe is brought to the temple, the person that first identifies his role as the Christ is a prophetess. And she not only is able to be in the role of a prophet herself, but she speaks in the temple. So she can obviously speak in the church. So that story, in the same way that we have the story of Ruth, which is showing Moabite women can be included, as can their children. Likewise, we have an important sacred story contributed to us by the author of the Gospel of Luke, that women can speak in the holy places, right? And are part of it. So like you say, we can have both. And so that's why literalism only works if you cherry pick. And so that's why we have to instead look at each individual author, all of the different contexts, and frankly, look at their limitations and discern the truth. So for our concept of Scripture in my church is that Scripture is not to be worshipped or idolized, that Scripture has been used to discriminate against classes of people, races. Our book of Scripture calls upon the church to repent of those practices and condemns those. And we also understand Scripture to not to be. So for us, theologically, Christ is the Word of God, not the Bible. The Bible is a human response to the divine, written by human authors at different times in history. And the purpose of Scripture then is not to be some kind of a rule book that is beating us over the head and oppressing us, but rather it's something that points us to God in our own lives as a living thing that's understood through personal revelation and spiritual understanding, right? And it's discerned for our own time. So Shaheen.
Yeah, I have a quick question.
Yes.
I heard somewhere that for a while when Paul was traveling and spreading the message of Christ, that he was traveling with a woman named Thecla.
Yes.
And that she was actually quite active and wasn't submissive in any way, and that she baptized herself.
Yes. So that's from a apocryphal book, or one of the letters, or one of the stories of Paul, the letters of Paul. It's the Acts of Paul and Thecla that didn't make it into the New Testament, so it's not non-canonical. So it isn't authoritative then for any of the Christian traditions, including the Catholic Church or the Eastern churches, although Thecla is, I think, regarded as a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church and has a shrine and thing like that. The story is essentially a Hellenistic romance novel, and it's an amazing tale, and so it's one of the reasons why it was among the most popular books in early Christianity. And so it was very popular. It's well preserved. It's illustrated and all kinds of things. But what we can mostly get out of that is it was quite normal in the early church. People understood that apostles often were went out by twos. This is when they still had a memory of apostles. So later, there's no apostles anymore in mainline of Christianity. But anyway, they're sent out in twos, largely, as Paul explains. Each one, the male apostle has his wife there, and the idea of it is because they're important Christian disciples, apostles who are women. And we have Junia, Paul mentions in the letter to Romans, who is a woman who's one of the apostles. And Thecla, in other words, is another, not a historical apostle, but all the people in the early church accepted that story because it was quite normal for them to understand that there would have been a female companion to the male apostle, right? And so that's, we can see that in terms of as we look back at the earliest church. Unfortunately, what ended up happening in that sort of a sense, so we're talking about like the tradition, as the tradition evolved, the components of the church that ended up being the proto-Orthodox, the church of the institutional church as it won, ultimately was able to follow this sort of suppressing women's voices more, or at least cordoning them into abbeys and nunneries and things like that, and as opposed to, let's say, being a clergy, which that would have been accessible as clergy before that was all formalized. So. All right, guys, we can continue this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
You're very, very welcome.
That was lovely, actually.